Thank you to Sundance Now for sponsoring this video. Sundance Now is a streaming service with hours of binge-worthy content, ranging from engaging dramas to supernatural series to fascinating documentaries. Sundance Now offers a wide variety of Sundance originals and hundreds of exclusive series from around the world you won't find anywhere else. They have new releases weekly, so you will always have fresh content to explore. I feel like I've gone through all of the content on other streaming services in the past year, so now having access to exclusive and new content regularly is refreshing. One of my favorite programs I streamed using Sundance Now is The Trial in the Outback, the Lindy Chamberlain story. Lindy Chamberlain made headlines in 1980 when she claimed a dingo had killed her 9-week-old baby, Azaria. With little evidence, Lindy was convicted of murder. She was released after serving 3 years of her life sentence, but had to spend 30 years trying to prove her innocence. I appreciated that the series dives into the details and facts of a case so mired in soundbites and assumptions, and explores the emotional impact of the death of baby Azaria, rather than just the controversy stemming from it. I enjoy Sundance Now because it is commercial-free and easy to stream. You can watch Sundance Now by downloading the app or streaming via Apple and Android devices, Amazon Fire TV, Google Chromecast, and Roku. Start streaming your next obsession. Sundance Now is available for just $5.99 a month, and you can try Sundance Now free for 30 days by going to sundancenow.com and using the promo code HEAVYCASEFILES. Judy Zellner served as the sexton at Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church, a small church in Springfield Township, Pennsylvania. She had keys to the church so that she could come in twice a week to clean the building. The church was located in a relatively rural area of Upper Bucks County, but its doors were always kept locked when services or activities were not in session for security. Judy was upset, therefore, when she put her key into the lock around 12:30 in the afternoon on January 23, 2008, and found the door was already unlocked. The light in the church office was on, but Judy did not see anyone sitting at the desk through the window in the office door as she came inside. Normally, no one else was at the church when Judy came to do her cleaning. She dropped off her things in the narthex and went up to the pastor's office to see if he was there. He was not. It occurred to Judy that the new church secretary, a woman named Megan, she had not yet met, may have been in the building. She went back to the church office, this time going inside. When she did, she found a woman lying behind the desk, surrounded by blood, which appeared to be coming from a large wound to her head. She did not appear to be breathing. Judy feared that whoever had hurt the woman may still be inside the building, so she grabbed the church's cordless phone and ran outside to call 911. She was understandably hysterical, so she had difficulty getting the operator to understand that she had found a woman she believed had been murdered inside her church. Paramedics quickly arrived at the scene. They found that the woman inside the church office was still alive. They also noticed that her head wound appeared to have been caused by a bullet, and that they were at a crime scene which they would have to disturb in their efforts to save the woman's life. While one paramedic brought in a backboard to bring the woman out to the ambulance, the other grabbed a marker off of the desk to outline the woman's body so the police would know how they had found her. He also caught sight of a shiny piece of metal that looked like it could be a bullet fragment and placed his ball cap over it so that it would not get knocked away when he and his partner moved the woman out of the room. Judy had told the 911 operator that she believed the injured woman to be the new church secretary, a woman named Megan. She still believed this to be the case as the paramedics picked up the woman to carry her out to the ambulance. When Judy finally got a good look at the woman's face, however, she realized she was not the new secretary, but Judy's good friend, Rhonda Smith. At 42, Rhonda was nearly 2 decades younger than Judy, but the age difference did not stop the two women from becoming fast friends when Rhonda and her mother Dorothy joined the church 2 years earlier. They sang in the church choir together, got together outside of church a few times a month, and Judy was always available to talk to Rhonda on the phone when she was going through something difficult. Rhonda had experienced numerous hardships in her life, right from its very beginning. 2 months before Rhonda was due to be born, her mother Dorothy had begun hemorrhaging. When the Smiths arrived at St. Luke's Hospital in Fountain Hill, Pennsylvania, they were told that their baby's umbilical cord had become wrapped around its neck, and Dorothy would need to undergo an emergency cesarean section in order to save the baby's life. Rhonda was born weighing 4 pounds 9 ounces, but still had obstacles to overcome. Doctors told her parents she required surgeries on her heart and her bowel, and they would need to transfer her to St. Christopher's Hospital for Children in Philadelphia to undergo them. Dorothy was experiencing complications from her C-section, so she could not travel with her daughter. Rhonda's father, Jim, therefore rode alone with the paramedics who were transporting his newborn daughter the 50 miles to Philadelphia. He spent the ride staring at Rhonda's chest, making sure she was still breathing inside of her incubator. Jim claims he saw an angel hovering at the top of the ambulance during the trip, and the sight of it convinced him that his daughter would be all right in spite of everything. When they arrived at the hospital, further testing proved him right. Rhonda no longer had her heart murmur, and her bowel problems had resolved, meaning she no longer required either of the surgeries. Jim Smith knew that his new daughter was a fighter. Jim and Dorothy would be rushing to the same hospital, again worried for their child's life, 42 years and 6 days later, after a social worker from St. Luke's called to inform them that Rhonda had been seriously injured at the church and was unlikely to survive. Doctors determined that Rhonda was brain dead, and the Smith family made the painful decision to remove her from life support. Rhonda had been shot twice in the head, and no gun had been found at the scene. However, authorities were not immediately sure that they were dealing with a homicide, and began investigating the possibility that Rhonda had taken her own life. Rhonda would rely on the fighting spirit she displayed right after her birth throughout the rest of her life. She was a courageous child who was never frightened of new things like other children her age, and instead of getting upset when her older brothers teased her, she teased them right back. At the age of 6, Rhonda decided she wanted to be a teacher and spent years working towards that goal. She graduated from Saucon Valley High School in 1984 and spent the next 2 years working numerous jobs to save up money for her higher education. In 1986, she enrolled at Northampton Community College, becoming the first person in her family to go to college. Rhonda graduated with an associate's degree in secretarial science in 1988 and enrolled at Bloomsburg University to complete her bachelor's degree and earn her teaching certification. She continued working while going to school and made all of her student loan payments on her own, without help from her family. She was set to graduate from Bloomsburg on December 15, 1991. Things started to fall apart for Rhonda just before she achieved this major goal, however. She lost her appetite and would go days without eating, and would go days without sleeping due to terrible bouts of insomnia. Rhonda's behavior became more erratic, and she became very paranoid, imagining people trying to break into her apartment and hidden cameras throughout the residence. She had to be hospitalized and eventually placed into isolation because she became aggressive when she believed the woman she initially shared a room with was a devil. During this first hospitalization, Rhonda was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a condition she would struggle with for the rest of her life. Rhonda did graduate from Bloomsburg less than a month after she received her diagnosis, but only with a degree in business administration, and not with the teaching certification she had been working towards for so long. She would take the final exam needed to earn her certification 3 times after her graduation, but she never passed it, as her condition was not yet well managed. Rhonda at first had difficulty accepting her diagnosis, but ultimately found ways to cope with it. In later letters, she would attribute the stride she made largely to her parents and their ongoing support and encouragement. The medication she took for her bipolar disorder prevented her from experiencing the severe episodes that had initially led to her diagnosis, but she did require hospitalization several times in the following years. Even as Rhonda learned how to best manage her bipolar disorder, it greatly impacted her life. Unable to be a teacher, she began trying to start a new kind of career, but even if she were able to keep a job for a few years, she would eventually experience one of the severe depressive episodes associated with bipolar disorder, and she would have to leave the position. This cycle continued for many years. Despite her financial instability, Rhonda insisted on living on her own and paying her own rent, something she took great pride in. Given her mental health history and the fact that Rhonda had previously discussed ending her life, authorities were not quick to rule out the possibility that Rhonda's death was the result of suicide. They theorized that perhaps Judy Zellner, who was friends with Rhonda, had found the gun when she found Rhonda in the church office and disposed of it so that no one would suspect suicide. They also considered the possibility that Rhonda's parents could have done the same thing. According to Dorothy and Jim, they had driven past the church on their way to lunch in the nearby borough of Quakertown just before Judy Zellner had arrived there. They were surprised to see their daughter's car in the parking lot, as she was only supposed to work until noon. Dorothy suggested they stop in at the church to ask Rhonda to join them for lunch, but Jim said no, since he assumed Rhonda was just getting a few extra hours of work. Authorities thought they perhaps had stopped in at the church and disposed of the gun for the same reason they thought Judy may have. However, video surveillance showed the couple entering and exiting the restaurant where they had lunch, showing no signs of distress. Furthermore, in this scenario, the couple would have removed the gun but failed to call for help for their still-breathing daughter, a seemingly unimaginable scenario, given how much Dorothy and Jim loved their daughter. Further forensic examination would later show that Rhonda had not committed suicide. She had been murdered. Based on gunpowder stippling and the wounds Rhonda had sustained, it was determined that Rhonda had been shot from 3 to 4 feet away, and that she had held up her hand in defense before the second shot was fired. Several potential suspects, like the man Rhonda had been dating casually a few months earlier, and a man she had met in a support group and was planning to go on a date with, were investigated and eliminated in the early days of the investigation. Investigators began considering the possibility that the murder had something to do with the church, rather than Rhonda. Very few people had known Rhonda would be at the church that day. The church's pastor, Greg Shreves, had to be away for a conference for 3 days, and an important church meeting was coming up. The church had recently hired a new secretary, but she had not started yet. At the last minute, Pastor Shreves decided to ask Rhonda to fill in at the church for those 3 days and assemble some of the packets and files needed for the meeting. He knew it would help her out financially and believed it would bolster her self-esteem. A strange visitor had attended a recent Sunday service. During communion, he attempted to steal the cup the wine was distributed in. When parishioners came up to him to greet him after the service, he told each of them that he was from different states. He also remarked how easy it would be to rob the church. While nothing had been stolen from the church, authorities still followed up on this man. Despite their best efforts, they could not identify him. Having no luck with the lead about the outsider, investigators pressed Pastor Shreves to try to identify anyone within his congregation he believed they should look into. The pastor could not believe that any member of his church could commit such a crime. Eventually, he did provide them with the name of a church member who had been causing problems at the church: Mary Jane Fonder. Mary Jane Fonder had been born in Philadelphia, but her family loved taking road trips up to the more rural areas of Bucks County. When Mary Jane was 12, her parents purchased a small cabin on a large plot of land in Springfield Township, and the family regularly spent their weekends there. While Mary Jane preferred Springfield Township to the busier and more stressful Philadelphia, she would not move out of the city and to her parents' property for more than 30 years. In 1987, she moved in with her parents, who were by then retired and living in Bucks County full-time, to help take care of them as their health began to fail. Mary Jane's mother passed away in September of 1992, and the following year, Mary Jane would find herself in the middle of a case that still remains unsolved: the disappearance of her father, Ed Fonder III. Ed struggled with the death of his wife. He took out the pain he was feeling on Mary Jane, who was still working as his caretaker, and the two started arguing regularly. Mary Jane says that around this time, her father began leaving the house again to walk around his property, sometimes walking up the back steps without his cane, something he had previously lost the ability to do because of his 2 hip replacement surgeries. According to Mary Jane, he would sometimes walk too far away from the house for her liking, and she would have to call him back, but her father's walks were otherwise uneventful. According to Mary Jane, she awoke on the morning of August 26, 1993, around 7 a.m., and got up to set the table for breakfast. She decided to lie down and rest for a bit longer. At some point, she heard the front door to the house open, and assumed it was her father going out to pick up the newspaper. She fell back asleep. She did not wake up again until 11 a.m. Her father was not in the house. Mary Jane called the police and alerted her neighbors, who helped search for Ed. An extensive search of the 12-acre property failed to locate him. Dogs tracked his scent to the end of his driveway, but it ended abruptly there. Ed was in poor health, and all of his medications were left at his house. His doctors estimated that he could only survive for about 10 days without his heart medication. Nearly 8 months later, Ed's wallet, with none of its contents missing, turned up in a mailbox in the nearby city of Allentown, but Ed himself remained missing. Given the rising tensions in their relationship, and the fact that she had been in the home when Ed went missing from it, Mary Jane was considered a person of interest in the case. Police were suspicious of Mary Jane's claim that her father must have wandered off, in part because of the improbability of that, given his poor physical condition, and Mary Jane's own attempts to support the idea. She claimed her father had recently wandered off, and it had taken her an hour and a half to find him. When asked why she hadn't called the police on that occasion, she said it was because she found him. However, she claimed to have called the police as soon as she noticed he was missing, on August 26th. The lead investigator on the case noticed a stack of items that appeared to have been ones that would be kept in the trunk of a car. She then asked to see the trunk of Mary Jane's car and found that it was completely empty, leading her to fear that Ed's body had been transported in it. She also saw a bucket of pink-tinged water inside the house, but did not order testing on it, which she later regretted. Despite suspicions from the authorities and rumors running wild through the community, Mary Jane was never charged in connection with her father's disappearance, and he remained missing. Mary Jane was generally considered to be nice enough, but a bit eccentric. She would eventually be described by one of her attorneys as the aunt nobody wants to sit next to at Thanksgiving. She was prone to rambling and oversharing, and did not seem to know when to stop talking. While she could be somewhat overwhelming to interact with, most people who knew her viewed her as harmless. Pastor Shreves had mentioned her to police because her behavior towards him had become concerning. Mary Jane had a fondness for painting, so he had asked her to use her creative skills to decorate the bulletin boards at the church. She ultimately did a poor job with them, but Pastor Shreves would give her other small tasks around the church now and then because she seemed to enjoy having special assignments at the church. Pastor Shreves would speak to Mary Jane when he saw her at the church, but generally tried to avoid her, as once she started speaking, she generally did not stop. One day in the fall of 2006, Mary Jane came into his office and began an hour-long talk about her life story. Pastor Shreves assumed she just needed to feel like someone would listen to her, and felt it was his pastoral duty to be that person at that moment. However, then, seemingly out of nowhere, Mary Jane said to Pastor Shreves, "You can't deny what's going on between us." The pastor was shocked and told her no, that nothing like that was happening. Mary Jane started back up with her story, but the shaken pastor asked her to stop. She got up and left the office, and he notified his bishop of what had happened. Mary Jane had started leaving long, rambling messages on his answering machine, up to 15 times a week. The pastor eventually had to block her number in the winter of 2007. She then began calling from her cell phone. The pastor played some of these messages for the church council, who did not want to get involved in the matter, and seemed to view Mary Jane's obsession as innocuous. In the summer of 2007, Mary Jane then began entering the pastor's home when he was not there, to put food in his refrigerator and freezer. In response, he told Mary Jane to stop, and began locking his door. She would then simply leave the food outside on the front porch. To drive home the point that he did not want her to do this, he refused to take the food inside, and let it rot in the bag on the porch. This resulted in angry messages from Mary Jane, from her cell phone, about how ungrateful he was about someone trying to take care of him. After one particularly late-night call from Mary Jane, Pastor Shreves snapped, telling her again to stop calling him, and that he could no longer be her pastor. He says her tone then changed dramatically, from her usual tone to something that sounded evil, as she berated him for saying that. None of this behavior necessarily tied Mary Jane to Rhonda's murder, but several details that came up about Mary Jane during the investigation were of interest to police. A search of state records showed that Mary Jane had purchased a .38 caliber Rossi revolver in December of 1994. A ballistics expert working for the state had examined the bullet found in the church and the bullet that had lodged in Rhonda Smith's brain, and found that they were .38 or .357 caliber, and that they could have been fired from several different makes of revolvers, including Rossi. Mary Jane had purchased the weapon the same day she had an unemployment hearing. She had applied for unemployment after being fired from a Denny's restaurant for threatening to kill one of her coworkers several times. The coworker had to appear at the hearing. Mary Jane's request for unemployment was denied. She did not attempt to bring the weapon she bought earlier that day into the courtroom, and the coworker was not harmed. Phone records also showed 3 phone calls made from Mary Jane's house to the church on January 21st, 2 days before the murder. They were made at 11:07, 11:10, and 11:25, all times when Rhonda was working at the church. The first call had lasted just 6 seconds, but the second was over 4 minutes long, and the third was 2.5 minutes long. This meant that Mary Jane was one of the few people who knew that Rhonda was working at the church for a few days. Authorities first spoke to Mary Jane when they attended a choir practice in order to speak with Rhonda's fellow choir members. She volunteered an explanation for the phone calls without prompting. She said she had called about getting a new church directory and had been surprised when Rhonda picked up the phone. Rhonda tried unsuccessfully to find one for her and took a message. Mary Jane also told them about her whereabouts on the day of the murder. She said she left home at 5 minutes until 11 and then went to the Holiday Hair Salon for an appointment before doing some shopping at the Joann Fabric store in the same shopping center. Mary Jane's mention of leaving home at 5 minutes till 11 caught the attention of investigators because that was almost the exact time of Rhonda's murder. Her internet activity at the church had abruptly ended at 10:54. Mary Jane told police that her brother had been home at the time and could confirm when she left the house. Despite the fact that he kept meticulous written accounts of his days, her brother could not in fact tell police the exact time his sister had left the house that day. Authorities visited the hair salon and found that Mary Jane had signed in there at 11:22 on the day of the murder. They drove the various routes from the church to the hair salon and found that Mary Jane had enough time to shoot Rhonda at 10:54 and arrive at Holiday Hair in time to sign in at 11:22. Mary Jane had a habit of wearing wigs. At her hair appointment on January 23rd, she had her stylist remove her wig and wash her real hair. The stylist informed police that Mary Jane had left the wig behind. They believe that if Mary Jane had just fired a gun prior to driving to the salon, there may have been gunpowder residue present on the wig. They obtained a search warrant and collected the wig. Testing of the wig showed the presence of only 2 out of the 3 chemicals needed to definitively show the presence of gunpowder residue on it, making the results inconclusive. Police had also asked Mary Jane about her revolver. She told them that she had only test-fired it once while she was on her property, shortly after her father went missing. She said she didn't like the loud noise it made. This did not line up with the actual time frame of her purchasing the revolver. Mary Jane claimed she had gotten rid of the gun in December of 1994. Mary Jane said she had the gun under the seat of her car when she went to her unemployment hearing and was afraid police would search her car and think she was planning on hurting her former coworker. She therefore threw the gun out of her car. She initially said she threw it out along the road or in the woods, but when the investigator asked her if she was concerned that a child may find it out in the open like that, she changed her story, saying that she had thrown it from her car into the deep end of nearby Lake Nakamixon. Mary Jane came into the state police barracks to speak with investigators in a more formal setting on February 25th. During this interview, Mary Jane provided details that supported investigators' growing theory that Mary Jane had been jealous of Rhonda Smith for reasons both real and imagined. One of the sources of her jealousy was based in reality. Rhonda had received financial assistance from several members of the church. She had been struggling financially at the end of 2007, and Pastor Shreves had contacted a network of some of the more financially stable members of the congregation, who sometimes donated money to other members of the church when needed. With their donations, Rhonda was able to stay current on her rent and her bills. 3 days before she was killed, Rhonda had spoken at the Sunday service. In her emotional speech, She thanked her community for the anonymous financial assistance, as well as for all of their prayers for her. Mary Jane spoke to several people about the revelation that Rhonda had received money from members of the church. She discussed it with enough people that she displayed a variety of attitudes towards the donation: surprise, curiosity, resentment, anger. Mary Jane told investigators that she was only hurt about Rhonda receiving financial assistance because no one had asked her to contribute. The other apparent sources of Mary Jane's jealousy were based on assumptions rather than facts. During this interview, she confirmed that she had a romantic interest in Pastor Shreves. She told investigators that she had very warm and sexual feelings about him. She also said she thought the pastor could have been in love with Rhonda. She thought his reputation was in danger because, according to her, lots of other people in the church also believed the two were romantically involved. Pastor Shreves was not, in fact, in love with Rhonda, and he was not having any sort of affair with her. Despite Mary Jane's perception that he gave preferential treatment to Rhonda, he did not even really know her all that well. He estimated that he had counseled Rhonda half a dozen times, and he was aware of her mental health problems and the financial strain they put on her. These were his only motivations for offering her 3 half-days of work while he was away at his conference, and for asking members of the church if they could donate money for her. Mary Jane also told investigators she felt as though there was a clique at church that included Rhonda but excluded her. Mary Jane and Rhonda were both members of the choir, but Mary Jane had told several people she would not be going to choir practice anymore shortly before Rhonda's murder. After the murder, she was at rehearsals, after never actually missing any. Mary Jane told investigators that a week before Rhonda was killed, she saw that several cars were left in the church parking lot well after choir practice was over. She also knew that Rhonda's birthday was the following day. She assumed that some of the women in the choir had thrown Rhonda a birthday party and had not included her in the festivities. "The whole world's going around this lady, and I don't know it," Mary Jane told the investigators. No such party had taken place. While investigators were learning that Mary Jane may have had reasons for wanting Rhonda dead, however misguided they were, they did not have enough physical evidence to conclusively say that Mary Jane was Rhonda's killer. They searched Lake Nakamixon twice to see if they could find the gun Mary Jane claimed to have thrown in it over a decade earlier, but could not locate it. They were able to use the February 25th interview, and the possible motives it revealed, to successfully apply for a search warrant for Mary Jane's car. They hoped that if Mary Jane had been the person who shot Rhonda, there would still be trace amounts of gunpowder residue in the car. On March 26th, police arrived to serve Mary Jane with a search warrant and to tow away her vehicle. This again brought out her more aggressive persona, and she ranted to state troopers until her brother came outside, telling her to shut up, and they were calling a lawyer. It would take several weeks for the testing on the swabs taken from various locations within Mary Jane's car to be completed. When the results came in, they showed the presence of gunpowder residue on the turn signal handle, the driver's seat, and the driver's side door of Mary Jane's car. The strongest way of connecting Mary Jane to Rhonda's murder would be to locate her revolver and test it to see if it was the weapon used to kill Rhonda. 2 searches of the lake did not locate the gun, which could have confirmed Mary Jane's story about throwing it into the lake from the bridge in late 1994, but given how deep the lake was in certain areas, finding the gun was not necessarily guaranteed, even if it was there. The weapon ultimately would be found at Lake Nakamixon, but under circumstances that pointed to Mary Jane's guilt, rather than her innocence. On March 29th, Doug Salisbury, a 40-year-old contractor from Quakertown, Pennsylvania, was spending the day fishing at Nakamixon State Park with his 8-year-old son, Garrett. It was the first day of trout season, and the father and son were fishing at the lake to avoid crowds at nearby creeks. A late rain was falling, so they fished from the rocky ground underneath the Haycock Run Bridge for cover. Garrett eventually grew tired of fishing and began walking along the shore. He noticed a heron wading in the water and told his father he was going to walk down the lakeshore to get a better look at it. Doug would later say he would never forget the moment when Garrett came back to him that day, holding a gun in his hand, and the fear he immediately felt for his son's safety. Doug owned firearms and therefore had stressed the importance of gun safety to his children. Garrett knew not to pick up guns, but when he first saw this gun, it looked blue because of the shallow, foamy water it was underneath. He assumed it was a toy gun, and it would be safe to pick up. It wasn't until he picked it up and felt the weight of it that he realized that it was made of metal and not plastic, like he thought, and that it was black instead of blue. He loosened his grip on the barrel and held the gun away from himself before taking it back to his father. After taking the gun from Garrett, Doug was horrified to see that there were 2 live hollow point shells, along with 3 spent casings, inside the gun. He threw the shells and the casings into the lake as Garrett walked him back to where he found the gun, because wet ammunition could be unstable, and therefore dangerous. Doug initially assumed that the gun had been dropped by a hunter, as the lake was surrounded by state game land, but when he brought the gun home, his wife instinctively knew that something was wrong with the situation. Doug therefore called the state police. The trooper who took Doug's call was immediately interested in the report of a Rossi 38, the same type of gun owned by Mary Jane Fonder, being found in Lake Nakamixon, near the Haycock Run Bridge, where Mary Jane had claimed to have thrown the weapon years earlier. He had Doug read him the serial number from the revolver. The serial number was a match to the serial number of the gun purchased by Mary Jane Fonder in 1994. Investigators went to Doug's home to collect the revolver. They then took him back to the lake so he could show them where it had been found. As they searched the area, they found the spent casings and live rounds Doug had thrown into the water. They also found a mostly full box of 38 special, high-velocity hollow point rounds, the kind of ammunition used by Mary Jane's gun, further out in the lake. The most damning evidence against Mary Jane came when her gun and the spent casings from it were tested by a state ballistics expert and compared to the bullets used in the murder. Analysis revealed that Mary Jane Fonder's gun was the weapon used to kill Rhonda Smith. Mary Jane Fonder was arrested on April 1, 2008, and charged with Rhonda's murder. She was taken into custody as she left a meeting of the seniors group at the church where Rhonda had been killed. During the meeting, she had sat next to Dorothy Smith, Rhonda's mother. While they had identified a motive and located physical evidence strong enough to charge Mary Jane with the murder, authorities would locate even more evidence after the arrest was made, which would later help them provide an account of Mary Jane's actions after the murder. While the location where the gun was found would seem to support Mary Jane's story about her disposing of it in 1994, the condition of the gun when it was found contradicted it. The gun had barely any rust on it, and no moss or other plant growth on it. Experts would later estimate that the gun had been underwater for less than 2 months, not the more than 13 years Mary Jane had reported. Police would soon discover evidence from an unexpected source that would show that the gun most likely went into the water just a day before it was found. Ed Fonder IV was supportive of his sister and did not seem to like the police investigating her very much, but that did not stop him from going in to see them on April 9th, when he found 2 small pieces of metal, which appeared to be bullet fragments, in his car. He had noticed the 2 small pieces of metal when they caught the light from the sun. Ed kept detailed notebooks of his daily activities, and many of these books had been taken into evidence. These notebooks revealed that Mary Jane had borrowed his car twice after her own vehicle was taken by authorities. She had driven his car to church on April 1st, the day she was arrested, and on March 28th, 2 days after she was served with a search warrant on her car. Investigators believe that once they took her car, Mary Jane realized that she was being seriously considered as a suspect, and that police would return with a warrant to search her house, which meant she needed to get rid of her gun. Her brother Ed recorded the mileage on his car before and after Mary Jane borrowed it on March 28th. According to his records, Mary Jane had put more than enough miles on his car to have driven it to the bridge over the lake and back. Police believe Mary Jane did not stop and get out of the vehicle to throw the gun and box of ammunition, as she presumably would have thrown them at the deepest point of the lake if she could choose where they would go into the water. They believe she instead drove back and forth over the bridge until there were no other cars around to witness her throwing the items from her car. She may have believed that if she stopped, she would potentially be seen by any cars that came along after she pulled over. She misjudged her timing when throwing the items, so rather than sink to the bottom of the deepest section of Lake Nakamixon, they ended up near the shore, where they were easily found by 8-year-old Garrett the following day. Mary Jane maintained her innocence even after her arrest, in spite of the physical evidence against her. She had no explanation to offer neighbors and church members who visited her in jail as to how her gun could have been used to kill Rhonda without her knowledge. She stuck to her story about throwing the gun in the lake in 1994 and theorized that someone must have found the gun back then and returned it to the lake after using it to kill Rhonda. Mary Jane's trial began in late October of 2008. Her attorneys tried arguing Mary Jane's theory that someone had found her gun in 1994, that Doug Silsbury had tampered with the gun to make it look like he had found it in pristine condition, and that Mary Jane's brother Ed was the actual killer, among other far-fetched theories. The jury did not accept these ideas and were apparently more swayed by the evidence presented about Mary Jane's irrational jealousy of Rhonda over scenarios she herself had imagined, and the findings of forensic analysis of her gun and the gunpowder found in her car. On October 30th, 2008, they found Mary Jane guilty of first-degree murder and possession of an instrument of crime. On December 5th, she received the requisite sentence for the first-degree murder conviction: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mary Jane still did not admit to killing Rhonda. At her sentencing hearing, she described herself as the second member of her church to be murdered, and she was now being murdered by the system. Mary Jane seemed to enjoy her time at Muncie State Correctional Institution, finding a captive audience to listen to her and a sense of community with her fellow inmates. Her new therapist put her on a new course of medication, and she lost 50 pounds in her first year of incarceration. She appeared to thrive under the structure prison provided her. "I feel like this is my destiny, like God wanted me to be here," she said in January of 2010. Mary Jane never fully took responsibility for the murder. She did eventually acknowledge that she must have been the person who killed Rhonda, but never fully confessed. In 2010, she told the Bucks County Courier-Times she had recently seen a picture of Rhonda in a newspaper and realized what had happened. In the days before Rhonda was killed, she had been experiencing periods of time she could not remember. She remembered going to the church that day, but then experienced another blackout and did not remember shooting Rhonda. Based on the evidence against her, she acknowledged that she must have been the person who killed Rhonda. Even though she now acknowledged this one reality, she still held on to one of the fabricated circumstances that led to her killing Rhonda. She still maintained that she, Rhonda, and Pastor Shreves were involved in a love triangle. While she claimed she was never jealous of Rhonda, she also claimed that the pastor was interested in a romantic relationship with her and would become flirtatious with her. She believed he would always look for her when he came into a room. She took this to be a sign of his romantic interest in her. Rhonda's family did not find comfort in Mary Jane's partial acknowledgement that she had taken their daughter from them. "It doesn't make us any happier. We gained nothing. We lost a daughter. Nothing changes my feelings right now. We're going to go through this the rest of our lives. No matter what happens, that's not going to bring Rhonda through this door," Jim Smith, Rhonda's father, said in response to Mary Jane's statements. He and his wife continued visiting their daughter's grave daily. In 2018, the family home where Mary Jane and her brother had been living at the time of the murder, and the 12 acres of property surrounding it, was sold to their neighbor, John Brunner. John had helped in the initial search for the elder Ed Fonder when he went missing in 1993, and had always believed Mary Jane was lying about her father's disappearance. He was therefore very cooperative when authorities asked to search the property as part of a renewed investigation into the disappearance, after they learned the land was sold. Mary Jane and her brother Ed had not been willing to allow such a search. On May 22, 2018, ground-penetrating radar was brought in to aid the search of the property. Nothing was found. Mary Jane Fonder died as a result of cardiac arrest in the prison infirmary less than 2 weeks after the search, on June 4, 2018. She was 75 years old. Bucks County District Attorney Matt Weintraub said in a statement that the search for Edward Fonder III would continue despite the death of Mary Jane, who he described as the only suspect in his presumed demise. Rhonda's father, Jim, passed away in 2012 at the age of 77. He is buried alongside his daughter in a cemetery in Hellertown, Pennsylvania.